So this is the Warhammer! And I have returned to talk about the geopolitics of the Greater German Reich and the Greater Japanese Empire! Let's do this! Alright, so out of the friction and the chaos of the First World War, we have two new powers that arise out of the chaos of the First World War. One of them is the Japanese. After the Meiji Restoration of 1867, the Emperor Meiji comes into power and he immediately goes about reforming and modernizing Japan. So all of the ancient feudal entities are abolished, like all of the ancient feudal kind of medieval different clans and stuff are replaced with federal municipalities and stuff. Railroads are built, factories are set up, and Japan grows economically. First kind of has a agricultural exporter, and then has a kind of industrial manufacturing hub of textiles. So Japan really prospers with the textile industry, and that's how it grows and builds its riches up to funnel and build an army. So the last of the samurai rebel in 1877. There is a rebellion of all of these different samurai, Ronin samurai, that basically they want to go back against modernity and return to a traditional kind of culture, but they're beaten. Their leader commits seppuku, and the samurai are completely abolished as a warrior class. And instead, all Japanese citizens, including commoners, are able to go into the Imperial Japanese Army. So almost immediately, Japan starts to expand overseas. The Japanese invade Taiwan and fight some of the different native aboriginal tribes in Taiwan or Formosa. And then they also invade and take over Okinawa. Then in the Sino-Japanese War, which is known as in Japan, has the Nishin War. There's a war that breaks out over Korea, and so the Japanese and the Qing dynasty fight. The end result is that Japan wins and defeats the Chinese Qing, and they take over Taiwan. They have influence in Korea, and they take some ports on the China coast. And this makes Japan the predominant Far Eastern power. In 1904, the Japanese and the Russians go to war, and the Japanese fight very well, although they suffer extremely high fatalities fighting the Russians. But in 1905, they defeat Russia. And as a result, Japan is recognized as an equal player with the Europeans, and all of the extraterritorial treaties that started to be signed from when Commodore Matthew Perry went to Japan and opened that country up from isolation are abolished. The last of these unequal treaties are done away with in 1911 to 1912. And so Japan becomes an important player. Japan even fights with other Western powers in putting down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and in 1910, they fully annex Korea. In the First World War, the Japanese defeat and overcome the Germans in Tsingtao, and they occupy Shandong and Tsingtao. And from there, they also occupy the Guangdong Peninsula. The Japanese also intervene in the Siberian expedition against the Russian Bolsheviks, during the Russian Civil War. They fight some of the Russian Reds, or the Russian Communist. And the ultimate end result is that Japan, with America, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, intervene in the Russian Civil War. And for a few years, they occupy the north of Sakhalin Island and different ports in Vladivostok and different areas in Siberia. And then in the mid-1920s, they withdraw. Northern Sakhalin is given back to the Soviet Union, and Japan keeps the southern half of Sakhalin. In 1928, during the warlord period, 1927-28, the Japanese invade China, and there's some battles and stuff in the Shandong Peninsula, but they withdraw. And a lot of this is a reaction to the Kuomintang takeover of Canton, southern China, and the end of the warlord period. Richard Murdoch, what's up, Kong? I'm doing well, buddy. Just being a hard man, baby. Let's go. Woo! Woo! Forge Gang. Banning is for pussies. Let's go. Yes, let's get it. Let's go. All right, so Japan is hit rather hard by the Great Depression, and its economy, for the first time since the Meiji Restoration, begins to sink. Japanese industry and capital enterprise with the Saibatsu was really doing good in the 1920s. Japan was doing really good with the textile and the silk exports. But in 1929, the Great Depression comes and Japan loses its international prestige in these light industries. So instead, the Japanese abandon the liberal kind of Western economic model, and by the late 1930s, they actually embrace different economic systems that are actually closer to the Soviet Union and to Nazi Germany, in the sense that the Zaibatsu mercantilize and kind of combine into monopolies and cartels, and they join into cliques with the military. So there is a lot of different cliques and fighting kind of cliques in the Japanese Army and Navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy is pro-Western. The Imperial Japanese Army is pro-Pan-Asian. And there is a lot of interest in having a Showa restoration and this notion of having a kind of return back to pre-Meiji era values that arises in Japan, and sort of this Neo-Confucian Japanese fascist type of thing. So in 1921, a Japanese philosopher, he writes this book stating that it is the duty of Japan to free the Asians from Western colonialism and bring about a new, greater Pan-East Asia order led by Japan. There is also this Tanaka Plan, the so-called Tanaka Plan that is made in the early 30s that says that Japan should build the entire world under one roof, headed by the Emperor Hirohito. So Japan recovers from the Great Depression, and the Kwantan Army invade Manchuria and take it over and turn it into Manchukuo, or Manchukuo. And they also bomb Shanghai, some certain parts of Shanghai, and the Japanese Navy has a bunch of battles with different Chinese soldiers and sailors and stuff. So in 1937, there is the Marco Polo Bridge incident that initiates the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese fully invade the Republic of China, and there is a lot of wars. One of the things that happens is the rape of Nanking, where they throw babies on bayonets and they rape tens of thousands of women and kill hundreds of thousands of Chinese in just outright butchery. So 700,000 to 1,500,000 Chinese are killed, but the Chinese do not necessarily give up the battle. So the Chinese Revolutionary Army, the Chinese nationalists, the 8th Route Army, and the Chinese Red Army unite in a common front, and they start fighting a war against Japanese aggression. And so the Japanese occupy almost the entire mainland Chinese coastline. They occupy Canton, Nanking, Beijing, and Shanghai, and all these different cities and stuff. And they basically go pretty deep into China, but it turns into a stalemate. The Chinese refuse to give up in their fight for national unification and democracy and socialism, and the Japanese want to utilize the resources of China to build up their colonial empire. So the Empire of Manchukuo, the reorganized national government of the Republic of China, the different Chinese collaborators, East Asia, Indochina, all of those areas become part of the greater Japanese empire. And Hideki Tojo sets up the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is going to be the mechanism for the revival of Asia. And the main slogan is Asia for the Asians. But later this changes to Banzai, Yamato Banzai, in the sense that the Japanese are a chosen race created by the goddess Hermitsu, or what was her name, Samaritsu or whatever, and the Japanese emperor is like the son of heaven. So the Japanese emperor has the mandate of heaven, he is the son of heaven, he is a living god, and all of the Japanese people worship him, and they worship the fallen soldiers and the fallen saints at Yuzakuni Shrine. What's up, Thievius Silic? What's good, brother? I'm doing great. I'm just being a hard man. Forge gang! Let's go! Alright, so that's the Japanese side. Now, on the European front, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists, they take over, has a majority in the Reichstag, and just a few weeks later, the Reichstag burns down. And there's a lot of different arguments about why it is that the Reichstag has burned down and stuff, and that is when the enabling acts are passed. So von Hindenburg dies, and Hitler takes over the mantle of both Reich's Chancellor and Reich's leader, or leader of the fatherland. He obtains the title of the Führer and becomes the supreme leader of Germany. So almost immediately, he begins to create the labor front, where German youth and German young workers are employed in mass projects of building stadiums, coliseums. The Autobahn is constructed, and the so-called people's car, the Volkswagen, is created or invented. And there's a lot of mass works projects, a lot of investment in basically creating a youth. The Hitler Jugend and the German Girls Union are set up, and the youth are mass indoctrinated. And also, there is reconscription into the Heer, the German army. The Kriegsmarine is created, which is the German Reich's Navy, the successor of the Imperial German Navy, and the Luftwaffe is created, which is the Reich Air Force. The military and the Wehrmacht are completely revitalized, and there is a complete remilitarization of society along the lines of National Socialism. The Nuremberg laws are passed, which creates a segregated society. So all of the Jews, half Juden, quarter Jews, and 1/8 Jews, they lose their German Reich citizenship, and they become fugitives of sorts. And they start to get locked up into concentration camps. There is also a eugenics program that is initiated, a secret police force that is set up, and all of the German Länder or German Lanzer are united and organized into a completely Unitarian state. It's set up into a full Unitarian state, and all of the different separate entities that had been in the Weimar Republic, which was a federation of free states, is done away with. So there is no more Bavaria, there's no more Prussia, there is no more Saxony, Rhineland, or Württemberg. It is all just Germany. So this is the beginning of the Greater German Reich, or the Third Reich. And so what they do is the German army marches into the Rhineland, and they completely remilitarize the Rhineland, and they stop paying off debts to the Versailles Treaty. So that is the end of the post-World War I international order. It is just treated as a mere scrap of paper, and it is just ditched. And the French and the British and the Belgians do absolutely nothing about it. So the Rhineland is retaken and reoccupied. The Entente Cordiale allies had already left anyways. The French had already left. So anyways, in 1936, you have the Berlin Olympics. There is also the Night of the Long Knives, where the National Socialists go after, what was his name? Ernst Röhm, and all of these different suspected traitors that were perceived as being too socialist or communist. And so they're all taken out. Ernst Röhm and the entire SR or SA are brutally executed, massacred, and killed off. All other different parties and stuff are abolished, and all potential dissidents are locked up and completely disenfranchised. There's also a mass exodus of Jews to Palestine or to Israel. So the Zionist movement and Germany signed the Havara Agreement that allows for the mass of Jews to go to Israel. So as a result, in the 30s and 40s, a lot of Jews go to the Mandate of Palestine in Israel. Well, anyways, in 1936, there is the Berlin Olympics. Swastika flags fly high in the great Coliseum stadiums, has massive sports events for the Reich take place. And Germany and the United States win most of those said medals. So in 1938, Germany invades and annexes Austria without so much as a shot being fired. And then, as a result of the Munich Agreement, the Sudetenland is annexed, and just a few months later, the rest of Czechoslovakia is annexed and incorporated into the Greater German Reich. The next thing that happens is that Lithuania hands over a port city to Germany also. So East Prussia is greatly increased as well. So also in 1939, Adolf Hitler celebrates his 50th birthday. And there's also a 25th anniversary for the founding of the NSDAP. So I want to point out about the massive influence of Jesuits in the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler continuously quoted saying that Heinrich Himmler was like Ignatius of Loyola, and that there is a lot of connections between the Jesuit order and the higher echelons of the NSDAP. The Jesuits' Jesuit Father Stempfel, might have actually written Mein Kampf for Hitler, or gave Hitler a manuscript for which he wrote Mein Kampf. So the Jesuit influence is absolutely profound. The influence of the Lateran Pact between the Vatican See, the Holy See, and the Greater German Reich is absolute. And over almost 40% of the Waffen-SS were Austrians. Like 30 to 40% were Austrian Roman Catholics. The leaders of the Waffen-SS and the leaders of most of the high-ranking top party bosses in the Third Reich are Roman Catholic. But there's also a very strong Protestant Lutheran influence as well. Another thing, too, Heinrich Himmler wanted to restore the ancient Saxon Völkisch religion. In time, as it was demonstrated at the Round Table talks by Hitler, they wanted to create a new esotericist religion to replace Christianity in Germany. The Lutheran and Catholic churches were to be outright done away with, along with all of the main Christian teachings, and sort of a pagan, Völkisch national sense of pride and ethos was going to replace the tarnished Judaic Christian doctrines in the Third Reich. The churches are organized into the Reich Church, the Protestant and Catholic Reich Church. There is a lot of protests from people like Bonhoeffer, who is a Lutheran minister that tries to create the Free Lutheran Church. He ends up in a concentration camp and dies. And so there's a lot of Catholic, clerical, and Lutheran resistance to this. But the vast majority of Christian denominations more or less go ahead and collaborate with this. So in 1939, there is the T4 program in which hundreds of thousands of the disabled are killed. Possibly as many as 20,000 autistic people are murdered as being supposedly useless eaters, and they are basically killed. A lot of offshoot sects like the Jehovah's Witnesses are completely abolished or put under heavy persecution and surveillance, and a lot of offshoots and stuff are heavily watched. There's a lot of strong censorship to where anything so much as criticizing the power and legitimacy of the party leads to one either being permanently imprisoned or shot for treason against the Reich. So anyways, in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and it collaborates with the Soviet Union in dividing up Poland, and all of the Poles are basically turned into second-class citizens. All of their intelligentsia is killed off by the Soviets and the Nazis. And there is also a bunch of mass hangings of Jews and homosexuals as well. And then later, there is the so-called Sitzkrieg. But eventually, Germany invades Denmark and Norway, followed by the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The French do not do very well. And within just a matter of weeks, the French surrender, and all of northern France is occupied and militarized. So Hitler and Hermann Göring decide to try to initiate the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe goes over the British airspace and proceeds to bomb a bunch of British cities. Winston Churchill is the prime minister, and he talks about this hatred for the Prussian yoke, this hatred of the menacing, oppressive Prussian yoke that is harboring over the free world at this time. Roosevelt also begins to send a lot of military aid and equipment to Britain. So anyways, in the Battle of Britain, London, Bristol, Liverpool, and a bunch of other important British cities are bombed and burn up in smoldering ruins, and a bunch of churches are bombed and destroyed. London, and especially the East End, are heavily bombed, and a bunch of people have to go underground or hide in smaller cities or towns. But more or less, the RAF is able to fight off the Luftwaffe. Probably twice as many Luftwaffe planes are blown up out of the sky as RAF planes, and so the British are able to win the air battle, but the Luftwaffe proceeds to perform mass carpet bombing of all of the major English cities and stuff. The Channel Islands are also occupied. The Africa Corps goes into North Africa, and there's a bunch of fighting in Libya. The Italians do not do very well. They have very inferior small tanks, so they have to call in the Africa Corps under Rommel. And so there's a bunch of fighting in North Africa that takes place. The Germans then invade the Balkans. Yugoslavia completely torn to pieces. The Croatian Free State under the Ustashi is set up. Serbia goes under the government of National Salvation. Romania and Bulgaria join the side of Nazi Germany, and then Greece is invaded. The British Army fight pretty well, but they get bogged down like they did in France, and they are kicked out of Greece. All of Greece is very quickly occupied. However, when the Germans send a bunch of air corps into Crete, the Battle of Crete is much tougher for them to deal with. There is also a lot of trouble with Albania as well. And then finally, Hitler performs his ultimate plan for the subjugation of the Slavs. And this is known as Operation Barbarossa. So in June of 1941, the Soviet Union is invaded by the Germans. And there is a bunch of massive great battles and high fatality rates. The winter and continuation wars happen with Finland. Leningrad is bombed into an absolute shit rabble, and over 1 million people starve in the greatest siege of history, the siege of Leningrad. About 2 million Russians die, and the Germans are very quick at taking over the Baltics and the Ukraine. And there's actually a lot of collaboration. People had been so repressed by the Stalinist purges that a lot of Ukrainians and Belarusians and Baltic people actually collaborate with the Germans and the Romanians when they invade. But by the time that winter sets in and they reach the outskirts of Moscow, the Russian winter begins to kill a bunch of the Germans. And the Soviet army retaliates, and the Germans are pushed back. So Hitler goes south into the Ukraine, and there is this thing called the Great Meat Grinder or whatever that takes place. All of the Ukraine and North Caucasus are occupied, but then comes the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, in North Africa, the British win the Battle of El Alamein, and the Americans also arrive, and eventually the Germans are surrounded and retreat to Tunisia, and eventually they retreat out of Tunisia. So at the same time, there is an attempt by the Germans to gain support from the state of Iraq. The state of Iraq that tries to create a national Arab rebellion against the British, and it fails. Also, there is a military campaign against Syria and Lebanon, which was under Vichy France, and that's basically really the only fighting that happens in the Middle East. So anyways, the Germans leave North Africa and the Allies invade Sicily, which they take very quickly with the help of the Italian mafia. And then there is the Battle of Anzio and the great battles and invasions of southern and central Italy. There is the Battle of the Anzio and Battle of St. Marino. So Mussolini is pretty much deposed, and the Kingdom of Italy surrenders and sides with the Allies. But Mussolini and the fascists in northern Italy create the Salo Republic, and they continue to fight until the Germans surrender. There is the great Battle of San Marino, in which the Allies gain a lot of ground as they break through the Gothic line and the Nordheim line or whatever, the Lombard and the Gothic lines, and they continue to advance through Italy. Eventually, Rome is bombed by the American Air Force, and eventually the Allies take Rome and continue to push up into Lombardy. So the next thing that happens is there is a massive air war in which the Americans and the British mass firebomb all of the major German cities. Also, the Germans are fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad. So with the Battle of Stalingrad, over 1.5 million Germans die. It's a pretty big hit for the German war machine. And the Battle of Stalingrad is a very important turning point in favor of the Allies. The Soviets are able to gain a lot more extra arms supplies. They're able to mobilize their population, but 2 million Russians die in the Battle of Stalingrad. But regardless, after the Battle of Stalingrad, and especially the gigantic tank battle of Kursk, so there is this gigantic battle between German and Russian tanks, which is known as the Battle of Kursk. It's a 3-day battle that takes place up around Volgograd, kind of around the Volgograd area. A bunch of villages are firebombed, plundered, and destroyed, and basically 1.5 million soldiers die. And the Germans do pretty well at first, but the Russian war machine by 1943 is able to outproduce the Axis forces, and so the Germans lose the Battle of Kursk. And from then on, the Soviet Red Army gradually retakes all of the major occupied centers. The siege of Leningrad is broken, and the Germans are pushed out of the Ukraine and back into the Baltic area, the Crimea, the Caucasus. All of the major central points of the Soviet Union is retaken by the Soviets, and they start to reach the borders of Eastern Europe. So the Allies finally perform what is known as D-Day, or the Operation Overlord. So it's almost postponed. Eisenhower almost postpones the D-Day landings, but finally it does happen, and the Allies, the Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Rhodesians, British, Free French, Free Belgians, and several other Allied units invade and storm the beaches of Normandy and successfully break out of the bridgehead. Also, Corsica and southern France are invaded as well, and within a matter of months, Paris is retaken or liberated, and the occupation of France begins to end. But by the time that the Allies get into central France, the Germans are able to thrust out and make a successful breakthrough or bridgehead, but it stops, and the Allies regroup, and they successfully drive the Germans out of France. Then in the Ardennes, in late 1944, the Ardennes offensive takes place, and again, the Germans are able to combine all of their remaining tanks, including the new Tiger I and Tiger II tanks, which are massive, very powerful tanks. Also, the Germans are able to create the first radio transmitters. They're able to use radio transmissions, and they fire V-1 and then V-2 rockets against London, England, and Belgium, and the Western Allies. They also use jets, and kind of the ancestor of the night bomber. You know those secret U.S. planes that hover, that go up in the sky and you can't detect them? The Germans are able to invent an early version of that, but the problem is that even though the Germans are very innovative with this new military hardware and tech, they don't have the resources, and it's simply too late in the war. But there is the battle of the Ardennes, the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Germans successfully break out, and they fight very well against American lines, and they kill a bunch of Americans, and they fight pretty damn well, but eventually they get bogged down, and the Americans retake all of their lost positions. Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands also isn't very successful, and the Germans do pretty well in the southern Netherlands. But the Soviet Red Army with Operation Bagration takes over all of Belarus and the Baltics, and they make it to the edge of the German Reich by 1945. So one of the things that happens is the Soviets rape 2 million German women. So 2 to 3 million German women are mass raped by the Soviet army. And there's a lot of atrocities committed against Germans by the Red or the Soviet army with mass rape and mass killings in East Germany. It's probably the most brutal in East Prussia, as has the Soviets take over Königsberg, the Great Battle of Königsberg and the end of East Prussia. So 700,000 Germans die in the air bombings, in the air war of the Allies. Dresden is completely bombed and completely blown asunder, and 1 million people die in Dresden in the mass fire carpet bombings in that mess. There is also napalm bombing of many German centers, including Berlin. And also there is a mass exodus of Germans from the east. There is a mass exodus of like 7 or 8 million Germans that are forced to leave Eastern Europe and East Prussia, and they have to go west. Eventually, the American army and the British and different Western Allied armies cross the Rhine and get into Germany, and they fight various pockets of resistance led by the Waffen-SS and by the, the German Home Guard, the Volkssturm. So Heinrich Himmler and Goebbels create and set up the Volkssturm, which is basically the home resistance. And they're armed with guns, semi-automatics, and rocket launchers, and they try to fight and retreat through barricades and stuff against the Western Allies. Ultimately, they collapse, and the Allies push through into central Germany. The Soviets take over Berlin, and there is a massive, massive bloodbath all across Berlin. The city is in complete and utter rubble. Over 1 million Germans and 1 million Soviets or Russians die in the fighting. It is very heavy. It is very painful. And the Soviets go from city block to city block, from house to house. It is exactly a repetition of Stalingrad in many ways. The Germans fight very valiantly and very heroically, but ultimately they lose, and the Soviet hammer and sickle flies over the Reichstag. Adolf Hitler, in his underground bunker, does not decide to break out and retreat. Instead, he opts to make his final will and testament to the German people and says that the Germans deserve what has happened to them. In the end, Germany was unable to gain the racial victory that she so deserved, and Adolf Hitler is forced to take his own life. He kills his dog Blondie, marries and kills his wife. He takes a pill of cyanide, places a gun to his head, pulls the trigger, and blows his brains out. And then the Waffen-SS guard, or the Schutzstaffel guard, takes his body together with his wife, and they put it out somewhere in this backyard, and they set it on fire with gasoline and bury it. And then later, the Soviets discover and find the remains of Hitler's body. With the death of Hitler, Joseph Goebbels becomes the leader, and then he kills and poisons himself, his wife, and all of his sons and daughters. After the death of Goebbels, it is decided that the Flensburg government will take over. The admiral of the Kriegsmarine becomes the leader of the German nation. The offices of Reich President and Führer are separated again, and the Flensburg government surrenders to the British in Denmark, in Eierberg in Denmark, or on the border between Germany and Denmark. And with that, the German army finally surrenders, and this is known as Victory in Europe Day. The Third Reich basically collapses on all ends and all sides. Resistance dies. The Germans are left completely homeless, embittered, broken, and pretty much destroyed as a people. Germany is then divided into 4 occupation zones by the Americans, the Soviets, the British, and the French. And so that is pretty much the end of the Third Reich. Now, with the T4 program, 600,000 disabled people, including 40,000 autistics, are killed and euthanized. And in the Holocaust, with the extermination camps, 11 million people are put into gas chambers and are killed, including 6 million Jews, which are gassed at Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and various other extermination camps. A bunch of Russians, Poles, Czechs, and other Slavs are also killed in this manner, in what would become known as the Shoah or the Holocaust. So anyways, in the case of Japan, Japan occupies Indochina and the Americans cut off oil and coal and steel to Japan. So the Japanese retaliate by bombing Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and attacking and fighting in Hong Kong and Singapore. The Japanese also invade the Dutch East Indies and Indonesia, and after a bunch of hefty fighting, they occupy all of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. They take over Hong Kong, Macau, Burma, Thailand, which joins the Axis powers. They take over Burma, Vietnam, Laos, and other Asian areas. They also invade and take over the Philippines. And so you have the Banton Death March, where several thousand American GIs and over 100,000 Filipinos die. So 1.5 million Filipinos die in the occupied Philippines. The Japanese also bombed Darwin in Australia and attacked different coasts of Australia. The Japanese also send these kind of weather balloons, which are armed with bombs, incendiary bombs on the U.S. West Coast. So as a result of this, the entire United States West Coast has to turn off all of their lights, as well as Canada, because of these incendiary bombs that are dropped on California, Oregon, and Washington. But anyways, the U.S. Army retaliates with the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, and so in the Doolittle raid, there is a big set of bombing campaigns against Tokyo, and even the Imperial Palace is bombed in the Doolittle raid. It's a very big, successful propaganda stunt. So anyways, the Battle of the South Pacific initiates, and there is a major battle that takes place around Guam and Midway Island. Now, the Japanese actually win the Battle of the Coral Sea, but they lose the Battle of Midway. The American army builds up a successful retaliation. They win the Battle of the Coral Sea, and they also win the Battle of Midway, and so Midway never falls like Guam and the Philippines do. The American Navy and the American Marines and armed forces make major invasions and landing attempts against the Japanese in New Britain, New Ireland, up the coast of Papua New Guinea. The Australians and the New Zealanders give aid to this, and eventually the Japanese are simply surrounded, outnumbered, and are torched and burned to death with flamethrowers. The Japanese perform various suicidal kamikaze charges, and the American army uses flamethrowers and burns them to death. They go into caves and they basically just burn the fucking shit out of all of these Japs. They all die in this massive torching stuff in caves. So, yeah, there's a lot of racial hatred of the Japanese. There is a bunch of propaganda and hatred against the Japanese, but the Japanese continue to fight on. So the Japanese actually take over Burma, they take over Rangoon, and they stop the road between Burma and China, the South China Road. They cut that off, and then they invade India. The Japanese wanted to try to create a collaborationist free Indian government, but it fails. There's two major battles in British India of which the Japanese lose because they are outsupplied, outmanned, and their, what do you call those things? Their back supply lines are overpowered. So the Japanese get felted in India and they withdraw. And the Burmese army, the British Burmese army, invade and retake Rangoon and easily sweep the Japanese out of the Burmese peninsula. At the same time, the Americans win the Battle of Tarawa, or Tarara, and they take over the Solomons. There's a bunch of major naval battles, naval assaults and stuff, all throughout the Solomon and New Guinea islands, and eventually all of those island chains fall under the Americans. There's also some battles between the British and the Japanese as well, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and at various places in the Pacific. And so the Americans gradually take charge and they push forward through the Central Pacific region, taking the Solomons, the Marianas, the Guineas, and so forth as they get closer to the Japanese archipelago. So anyways, in China, the Japanese initiate the Ichigo invasion plan, which is the greatest land offensive in China of the war. This happens in early 1944. The Japanese take over a bunch of major bridgeheads, railroad transfers and stuff, a bunch of fighting with the Chinese nationalists that take place. The Japanese take over cities, railroad hubs, railroad transits in this no Ichigo plan and stuff, but they lose a lot of men. So anyways, also, what's his name? Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese communist leader, who is basically a guerrilla fighter, successfully fights and gets military and material aid from the Americans in fighting the Japanese in Vietnam, and as a result, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese are able to drive the Japanese out of the interior of Vietnam. And this is kind of the origins of the Viet Cong. So anyways, the Americans retake the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They take over the Solomon Islands, the Marianas. They push up the Pacific Rim. Lots of heavy fighting and heavy battles, and it gets worser and worser every year, and there is still higher and higher fatalities. So by 1945, the Americans fight on the island of Iwo Jima. This is the greatest battle with the highest fatalities of U.S. Marines in history. But after a very long, very brutal, and very condescending fight, the U.S. flag, Old Glory, is raised on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, and the Americans take over the volcanic island of Iwo Jima after very heavy, very brutal, and very gut-wrenching fighting. That's almost hand-to-hand fighting. Very primal, very medieval, very brutal, and a lot of Japanese get felted by that. With the Battle of Okinawa, which is an island to the south of Japan, there is another round of extreme hefty fighting that takes place. 500,000 Japanese die, or 700,000 Japanese die. 2 million Okinawan civilians die. Naiha in Okinawa is completely burned and incinerated. The palace in Naha is destroyed by the Marines. The Americans fight very brutally. The Japanese resist. They retreat into caves up in the mountains, and they hold off for a very long time in a siege. But eventually the Americans push through. There's a bunch of bombing, massive carpet napalm bombing, a bunch of charges and firing from AA guns and from various types of artillery pieces that are fired onto these bases, and eventually the Japanese army surrenders and Okinawa is taken over. It is probably one of the most brutal, horrendous, blood-wrenching battles of World War II. So the next thing that happens is from 1942 and on, the Americans firebomb and napalm bomb all of the Japanese cities. So Yokohama, Tokyo, Yokohama, Naiha, all of the Japanese major centers are firebombed into obliteration. There is the Great Tokyo Fire that breaks out in early 1945, in which in one American raid, like some 300,000 Japanese are killed. It's a pretty brutal thing. Lots of Japanese civilians die. So 2.5 Japanese die and 5.6 million Germans die in the Second World War. Very brutal fighting. There is actually almost a military attempt to take over and overthrow the emperor and try to convince him to keep fighting in the war, but this is prevented and it stops. And so the Japanese build up a large home army and defense force, and they start trying to make preparations for an invasion. But the Soviet Union invades southern Sakhalin and Manchukuo, and there is a bunch of heavy fighting in which 700 to 1 million Japanese die, and all of Manchuria is invaded by the Russians. And then the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, and there is a massive felting of over 1 million Japanese on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And then just a few days later, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, completely, absolutely grounded to nothing. And so the Japanese Emperor Hirohito comes on the radio and denounces his own divinity as a living god, and says that the Americans have created mass weapons of superior destruction that the Japanese are not going to be able to win, and so Hirohito declares a ceasefire. And this leads to the process of the Japanese surrender. And this marks the end of the greater Japanese Empire and the end of the Second World War. All of the Japanese Imperial Army and naval forces surrender en masse to the Chinese, the Americans, Australians, the Russians, and the British. And the Japanese and the Germans get really felted bad. At the Tokyo trials, Hideki Tojo is sentenced as a war criminal and is hanged by the Allied High Tribunal after the Tokyo trials. There is the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials for crimes against humanity, in which various German and Japanese war criminals are put to death as punishment for the mass atrocities that were done in the Second World War. And so that is the geopolitics of the greater German Reich and the greater Japanese Empire. I hope you enjoyed it. Richard Murdoch says, "What's up, King? Banning is for pussies. Let's go." Thievius Slick says, "What's good, brother?" Forge Gang! Cool Tactic says, hold on a second. Cool Tactic, going after doxes and people's families is not very hard. Okay, so you're a fucking troll and an idiot that's trying to derail the conversation. So my response to that is that I was asleep when Euros was streaming, and I have no idea who it was that name doxed and face doxed Euros. So that's not my problem, and I don't care. Euros did it to himself. Banning is for pussies. That's right! Rom was a homosexual. I don't know. He might have been. Yeah, Rom was a homosexual. That's right. Hey, what's up, Chauncey Fat Sack? What's going on? I'm just talking about some of the geopolitics of the Axis powers in World War II. Let's see here. Banning is for pussies, sup, N-word. Did you kill Kino? Dude, I'm producing the Kino right now, bro. Are you talking about the Euros docs or the Euros doxing, bro? Euros did it to himself, bro. One of the J-Dank's army people doxed him. I don't know who it was. And if you watch my videos and stuff, you'll know that I don't get on with J-Danks. Thanks for the Burger Boy says, thanks for these historical info streams. They are awesome. You're welcome, bro. You're very welcome, man. You're welcome, Burger Boy. By the way, Burger Boy, you are 100% right about Euros and the Kino Corner. Now it's just the sus carnival. There is definitely an Aussie mind virus, and Euros and the sus corner is a perfect example of that Aussie mind virus you were talking about. Chauncey says, Rattenkrieg. Yeah, dude, the German Nazis really did fight a very strong and very drenched out war, man, but in spite of all the efforts they put up, they lost in the end, pal. Banning is for pussies. Off Stalin, off Churchill, off Roosevelt. Ade, ade, ade. Forge Gang! Let's see here. Brucey Kaboots, what's up, man? Very interesting stuff. You're welcome. Godspeed, Warhammer. I enjoyed it. Euros is Forge Gang. Warhammer wouldn't do that to a nigga. No, dude. I'm fine with Euros. I just don't like some of the shit that he talks about. I disagree with that, but I don't totally disavow him. Chauncey Fatsack, I love your politics. I believe you. Yeah, if anything, it was probably Shaggy that doxed Euros or one of the J-Dank's army people. You can't really trust Shaggy for nothing, bro. Brucey Kaboots, Euros has denounced Forge Gang. No, he didn't denounce it. He said that he was the new leader of Forge Gang. Euros was saying that I had been replaced by him as the leader of Forge Gang. Well, that didn't last, did it now, huh? Shit. Yeah, definitely a gay op. Yeah, I thought it would be third parties just trying to stir up shit. It's the J-Dank's army and plate gang that messed with Euros, bro. Alright, so are there any more questions pertaining to this discussion or what, man? Euros was scum from the beginning. I wish you would have listened to me when I told you flat out he was trying to mess with you. Yeah, I mean, Mormon Shaggy and various other people like Ghost of Niccolo were telling me the same thing. I guess I should have listened to you better, Burger Boy. Euros is an absolute piece of garbage, and he just simply wanted to use me for the clout. So Euros was looking for someone that was easy prey to clout chase, and he chose me and took advantage of it for a while. But I was never Euros's pet retard. That is such a bunch of bogus lies. But yeah, I agree with you, Burger Boy. Anyways, I guess that's it. Y'all take care.